Okay, we are live on YouTube, I see.
I'll put a link here in a second.
So shall we begin, or shall we wait still a little bit?
I think we can begin and then.
Great. Welcome everybody to the Princeton Bucharest virtual seminar in early modern philosophy. And today we're having a roundtable on Pierre Hadot and the idea of philosophy as a way of life. And our three speakers are Dana Jalobanu, Sorana Corneanu, and Paul Lodge. We're going to have three presentations first, and then a common discussion at the end. So Dana, why don't you begin?
Thank you. Let me just give a very, very short explanation as to why I insisted on this session. Some of you might remember that at Brown we did a number of things at the regular Princeton Bucharest seminar. We had talks, we had reading groups, and we had those sessions in which people would do what they really like to do, regardless of the deadline and regardless of the very urgent things they have to do every day. So that's what we are doing tonight in what I am concerned. This is a paper that I produced specially for this seminar and especially for this evening on things that I've been working on, but they are not, they're not the thing that I have to submit next day. And I'm very grateful that I could do this exercise here. This week, and I can present the result here. And actually, if you want to have a look at what I'm going to say, because I don't have a PowerPoint, then there is a link to a Google Drive and there is a text there. And you might want to have a look there because there are plenty of examples in what I'm going to say. So reading, meditation, and enactment are those formative exegetics is the title of what I'm going to say. Pierre Hadot's long-standing belief that theory is never separated from practice led him to outline the program of a philosophically informed history of philosophy centered on a methodology of reading. And here are the key elements of this methodology. First, when approaching a text, look for the spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises, of course, constitute a trademark of ancient, but not only ancient philosophy. Second, remember that the recording of spiritual exercises is highly codified by the cultural context, by genre, by references, and various other formulas which the historian has to identify before embarking into the interpretation. This means that when I approach a text, I have to proceed a bit like a detective trying to solve a case. I have to look for clues. The first important clue is that spiritual exercises are encoded in the text, most probably in a language that has ceased to be familiar. They need to be unwrapped from layers of often unidentified references. But in order to do that, I have to decipher, clarify, and understand what Hadot calls the bricolage through which a text is assembled. Only after the clues and elements of the puzzles have been found, clarified, and laid out, I can proceed to a work of interpretation. And all this is called by Hadot formative exegetics. My purpose tonight is to explain a bit further this concept and to illustrate how it works and what we can gain if we follow Hadot's precepts. So point one, look for spiritual exercises. This is an umbrella term designating a wide array of practices. Reading, research, and meditation can be spiritual exercises, but so can be many other things. Detaching yourself from the present moment, trying to put things in perspective, counting to 10 when angry, can be spiritual exercises, at least if you are performing them with a philosophical purpose. Hadot claims that such practices become spiritual exercises if they are directed towards a transformation of the self. As has been repeatedly said, Hadot did not offer definitions or classifications for his spiritual exercises. He did offer examples, discussed some classes of exercises such as the premeditatio malorum or the view from above. But his reader remains with the impression that there is something elusive about this whole business. At least this was my impression when I read Hadot many years ago. And yet I found reading his works extremely engaging and kept revisiting them over the years. And now I finally think that I discover how to use this formative exegetics. In what follows, I will investigate a particular class of spiritual exercises, one that I would call, following Hadot, imaginative exercises. And I will look at them from a perspective familiar to the historian of science. I will look at them as records of practices. Imaginative exercises are complex exercises, often involve both the body and the soul. As described by Musonius Rufus, they aim to, quote, accustom oneself with the cold, to heat, to hunger, to frugal nourishment, to hard beds, to abstinence for pleasant things, and to tolerance to the unpleasant things. We find records of such exercises in Seneca's letters to Lucilius. Here is one that we can all do together. Live like a poor man for a week. We can find this in Seneca's letters, and we can find the recipe of how to do that. And we can also find vivid recordings of something that looks like practice. My favorite recording of the result of this exercise is in letter 87, where the exercise in frugality turns like an attractive picture of a carefree holiday. And I give here a quote: Maximus and I have been spending a very happy couple of days. My pallet lies on the ground and I on the pallet, with one of my two cloaks serving to cover and the other, one is a bed and the other to cover me. If I have bread, the figs are my side dish. If not, they are my bread. The carriage I ride is just a country wagon. The mules give no evidence of being alive except that they are walking, and so on and so forth. Quite nice. In some cases, Seneca's imaginative exercises involve more complex tasks, such as in the letter 65, where Lucilius, who is the governor of Sicily, we are told, is asked to climb the Mount Etna in order to carefully observe the level of the snow and note whether it is indeed so different than in the past years, and as some reports have indicated. In this case, we do not have the recording of the exercise, but merely the set of instructions and what Lucilius is supposed to be doing to note where the level of the snow really is. And we are left with a question: was this something that Lucilius was supposed to do? Mount Etna has 3,300 meters high, so ascending Etna must have been a serious undertaking. Or would it have been enough to imagine the expedition? To follow in the imagination the ascension while pondering on the various theories one must choose on the basis of the resulting observations? We can, of course, ask similar questions in connection with the other exercise, live like a beggar. Does one really have to fast and sleep on a hard bed for a week, or imagining this is enough? Now, this is how the exercise is recorded in letter 18. I'm determined to test how firm your mind really is, Seneca says. I will give you the same instructions that great men have given. Set yourself a period of some days in which you will be content with very small amounts of food and of the cheapest kinds, and with coarse, uncomfortable clothing, and say to yourself, is this what I was afraid of? So in the same letter, Seneca claims that one must really do the exercise, that this is actual training, and also that it's not enough to do it merely like an exercise of the body. To use a more familiar example, it is not enough to practice what we call today intermittent fasting. Here's a quote: "Let your palate be a real one, your blanket really burlap, your bread actually hard and coarse. Endure it for 3 or 4 days, sometimes more, so that it won't be a game, but really a trial." We have thus detailed instructions. We have a context. We can discuss in the quick Q&A if you are interested more on the particular context. And we have the envisaged expected result. So what will happen with a person who does these exercises in the right manner and with a sufficient number of times? Well, presumably he transforms into the serene, carefree philosopher that we have seen in letter 87. The one who travels in the mule-driven cart. In the letter 87, the recording of the same exercise is much more complex, and the imaginative scenario is supplemented by meditation. One is asked to use the imaginative exercises in the context of a more general discussion regarding the nature of poverty. But I'm not going to go into these details. Let's just see some points of imaginative exercises. They are very complex. Enacting them can involve a wide range of practices. They are both mental and physical and involve some reading and familiarizing yourself with the context. They are widespread. Seneca claims this is something that everyone knows. It's coming from the ancients. They travel from a school to another. And in fact, in his letters, Seneca often quotes Epicurean exercises. So imaginative exercises are items that travel from one context to another. And they can be recorded in different manners. In a more abbreviated and poignant philosophical form, as we will see in a minute in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or in a literary, sometimes theatrical, often emotionally charged form in Seneca's letters or in the Seneca's Naturales Questiones. Imaginative exercises are recorded very differently, and this reflects perhaps a difference in practices, as well as a difference in genre, authorial intention, or the public one has in mind. Moreover, imaginative exercises are often recorded in different ways by the same author in the same work, and these are the examples that I'm going to discuss. As Hadot has shown, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius are filled with imaginative exercises, which place before our eyes various embodiments and examples of the Stoic dogmata, such as the eternal mutability of nature, the recurrent cycles of the universe, the waves of mutability and transformation. These are all quotes from from book number 9. And one of the recipes that you find it everywhere is the view from above, and we are going to talk about this. This comes in different contexts and it's explained in different ways, or it's pictured in different ways. One favorite way in which Marcus Aurelius practices the view from above is to meditate upon death. For example, we are required to imagine burials of people that we know, burials of people that we have heard of, a long chain of burials moving to ancestors of public figures, historical figures, or heroes or philosophers. Or we find things like, think of how many a Chrysippus, a Socrates, an Epicurus has eternity already swallowed. In other exercises, the requirement is to imagine how the entire court of Augustus was wiped out by death, how whole generations have disappeared, while cities such as Herculaneum and Pompeii have been wiped out in their turn. The feeling of repetition is clear, and also is a kind of, we will see in a moment of more the whole exercise, there's a kind of crescendo that Marcus uses time and again to move from picturing individual cases and examples of deaths, individual deaths, to courts, cities, and generations. Marcus exercises are also picturing another common feature of imaginative exercises, namely the fact that they can be recorded in ways that are vivid, striking, imaginative. They are at the same time a very good illustration of the other point that Hadot makes. They are highly codified. And their context has been partly lost. And that's one of our problems today. One needs the detective work of a good edition, for example, to retrieve the details, which are usually somewhere hidden in the footnotes. We don't know these persons that Marcus talks about, or even if we do know, we don't know the context of their death. And sometimes even with the details that the good edition is providing us, the interpretation is still difficult. So, as I hope it's clear by now, I can intend to say that we all do imaginative exercises. If scared or angry, we try to distance ourselves from the present events, to imagine ourselves in a distant future, for example. Or very far away, looking from above, trying to put things in a different perspective. Some of us might even consciously practice what Hadot calls the view from above, in which we imagine ourselves raised above the earth in the atmosphere, seeing everything from a very distant and very comfortable point of view. Now, due to our familiarity with pictures of the earth seen from above, this is not anymore an exercise. It's just the recollection of a picture coming from the International Space Station, for example. When asking to do the exercise of the view from above, Seneca's interlocutors and readers would have first to read Cicero's Dreams of Scipio and Seneca's Naturales Questiones, maybe Plato's Phaedrus as well, in order to form the mental imagery with which one could really practice the view from above. And perhaps this is precisely why such exercises have lost their spiritual and transformative connotation today. So perhaps the wrapping of the imaginative exercises is what really counts. And the unwrapping of the bricolage is the thing that one needs to do, the trick leading to one's transformation. So let's see how this is supposed to work on an example. And let's take an early modern example, Bacon's The Advancement of Learning. There is a passage in Bacon which is made of 4 different quotes. One comes from Seneca's Naturales Questiones, one comes from Epictetus, one comes from Virgil, and the passage is saying something like this. So certainly if a man meditate much upon the universal frame of nature, the earth with man upon it, the divineness of their soul except, will not seem much other than an ant hill, whereas some ants carry corn, and some carry their young, and some go empty, and all to and fro a little heap of dust. It take it away or mitigated fears of death or adverse fortune, which is one of the great impediments of virtue and imperfections of manner. For if a man's mind be deeply seasoned with the consideration of mortality and corruptible nature of things, he will easily concur with Epictetus. Now the Epictetus passage begins, who went forth one day and saw a woman weeping for a pitcher of earth that was broken, and went forth the next day and saw a woman weeping for her son that was dead, and said, "Do you believe that he is immortal?" And so on. The Virgil quotes begins at that point. So it's a bricolage, an assembling of 3 different texts. On the basis of a passage from Seneca's Naturales Questiones, Bacon enacts the view from above, looking from the right perspective on human life and all the political squabbles. And Seneca's passage says something like this: if someone gave human intelligence to ants, will they not divide a single threshing floor into many provinces? Once you have ascended to those truly great regions, wherever you see armies marching with standards raised, and as though something great were happening, cavalry now protecting the rear, now exploring ahead, now spread out on the flanks, you will want to say the black column marches across the plain, Virgil, Aeneid. It is a mere scurrying of ants toiling in narrow confines. What difference is there between them and you, apart from the size of their tiny bodies? What you see here is that Seneca also does a bit of bricolage. And if you want, we can go into the details in the question and answer, because it's an interesting way of doing this bricolage. But I just wanted to give you as an example of the bricolage. Mark that there is an interesting thing that Bacon is doing here. Seneca uses this to put the Earth in the right perspective in space. It's just like a needle in the universe, and time. It's just an instant in which this is happening. Bacon uses the bricolage, uses Seneca just to say that the Earth is no more than a heap of dust. And then the temporality is extracted from the Epictetus quote. Okay, this example illustrates a bit the difficulties of the bricolage and Hadot's way of reading at work. We have seen that at the center stage is a spiritual exercise, the view from above. We have also seen that the recording is wrapped into layers of formulas, patterns, argument sources, things like this. Being, in terms on Hadot terms, a brilliant reuse of prefabricated items. And in his book, The Veil of Isis, Hadot traces the history of some such formulae, showing interesting and sometimes fascinating instances of this historical bricolage at work. We have seen in the example how some themes and formulas are assembled creatively, changing the meaning and so on. So briefly put, what we have, I think, is a loop. An imaginative exercise is first recorded as a sort of set of instructions, live like a beggar for a week, then enacted and re-recorded as part of a philosophical argument, then perhaps reenacted and re-recorded again in a more complex form as perhaps a teaching or a heuristic device. At each of these successive recordings, the writer uses these block elements, references, questions, formulae, to render in writing as much as possible from the set of practices used to enact a particular imaginative exercise. Now I have a kind of example which puts in contrast two types of recordings. One is Marcus Aurelius' Meditations on Death. The other one is coming from book 3 of Seneca's Naturales Questiones. I obviously do not have time to go through all the details, but I would like to read together with you this passage from book 8 of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations that you can find on page, I don't know which page of my paper, 14, section 4 in any case. But you don't even need to read it. Let's just do it together. So Meditations upon Death, starting with individual instances and going in a crescendo to the fact that everyone dies. Reflect constantly how many doctors have died, after often knitting their brows over those who were ill. And how many astrologers, after predicting the deaths of other people as if death were some great thing. And how many philosophers, after countless debates about death and immortality. And how many heroes, after killing many other people. And how many tyrants, after exercising the power of life and death with terrible arrogance, as though they were immortal themselves. And how many entire cities have died, if one can put this in this way, Helicon, Pompeii, and Herculaneum, and others without number. Part 2, run over the ones you know, one after another. So, rehearse all these instances, individual instances. One person's attended another funeral and then was laid out himself, another followed him, and all in a short time. Point 3, taking it all together, keep always in view that human life is transitory and cheap. Yesterday, a drop of semen, tomorrow, a buried corpse or ashes. Point 4 and last, so make your way through this brief moment of time in line with nature and let go of your life gladly, as an olive might fall when ripe, blessing the earth that bore it and grateful to the tree that gave it growth. Let's unpack this very beautiful thing. The structure seems to be the following. First, we have individual instances, then classes, then masses, cities, in an emotional crescendo. Then we have a sort of induction that leads to grasping the true nature of what we call life, a transitory phenomenon. 3, the transitory phenomenon, is the general maxim one has to learn from this exercise. And then the 4th part is the rule of life, applying the maxim in my own life, in my daily behavior. Behave like an olive that falls from the tree. But what is the role of the extremely vivid and sometimes self-standing examples? According to Hadot, Marcus' meditations are part of what he calls a discipline of ascent. The purpose is to change the received, deeply entrenched representations that death is something scary, bad, or grandiose. One does that by this repeatedly rehearsing of exercises of imaginative repositioning, which help us correcting false representations and concepts. But also this repositioning and this correcting of false representations only happens if we read these exercises in a special way, trying to enact the imaginative scenario, trying to follow in your imagination these examples. This is not always simple, since, as we have seen, we have lost many elements of the context. In addition, Marcus' meditations are very personal. They are carrying some of his thought. In some cases, it's relevant to remember that he is the Roman emperor. So what we do when we read Marcus Aurelius, and we do that subconsciously many times, is to kind of replace his examples with our examples. When he thinks of strings of dead lovers and gives their names, of people who have, just imagine lovers standing by the coffin of their loved ones until they are very old and so on. We don't know those names, but we can replace it with our names from our favorite literature and so on. But okay, perhaps these exercises are not the most transparent because they are not meant for teaching. So let me give you a last and final example of imaginative exercises to which I think we can relate in a way easier than to Marcus. And we can unpack the bricolage in a way that is easier, despite of the fact that this comes from one of the most obscure works of the whole antiquity, which is Seneca's Naturales Questiones. I'm not going into details. I can answer questions about why is this obscure. And the example I want to give you is from book 3 of Naturales Questiones, which is also sometimes put in the front of Naturales Questiones as book 1, the book on waters. That's all that is of interest for us tonight. So what we have there in the Naturales Questiones, and I will draw your attention to it, is an additional pedagogical dimension. The book on waters is supposed to offer us theories, conjectures, examples, and imaginative exercises that are supposed to make us aware of the changes, vicissitudes, and calamities that waters can produce. We encounter extreme phenomena, storms, floods, poisonous waters, hot and boiling spring, together with numerous naturalizing explanations of the above. The first part of the book is a sort of exposition of the received theories on the relation water-earth, for example, on the terrestrial globe, the possible origins of waters, terrestrial, subterranean, etc., including what Seneca claims is his favorite theory, a theory which might be called, and I'm going to call, dynamic equilibrium. This theory is first conveyed to us with the help of an exercise in analogy. Seneca states that the system of the earth is very much like our body, a unity of dissimilar parts with different functions, subject to continuous transformations. The system of rivers and Earth's ocean correspond with our system of veins. Empty caves and volcanoes correspond to our system of arteries. The diversity of terrestrial waters parallels the diversity of bodily moisture. Health is the equilibrium in the body. There is a similar equilibrium at the level of the terrestrial globe. Now, how can you substantiate such a thing? I think that in the second part of the book, Seneca brings all sorts of imaginative exercising, leading to a better understanding of what equilibrium means. Some of them are simple and they bear striking resemblances with recipes. In other cases, they are like, climb Etna and measure the level of snow. So there is one in the paper that you have, pour water over quicklime and it will boil. In this case, the imaginative enactment is supposed to habituate us with a particular effect. If you pour water over quicklime, it will boil. If you ever seen how this water interacts with quicklime, you will not do this trial again, but you will simply remember what happened, realizing that you are in a possession of a possible mechanism that explains hot springs. You cannot, of course, be sure that this is the case, but this is a possible explanation. There are more interesting exercises than that. One looks very much like an experiment. Seneca said, you have seen that in some lakes, the swimmers are floating, they don't sink. And there is in Syria a pool where the bricks float. And the reason for this, he said, is obvious. Weight anything you like and put water on the other side of the scale. So take a balance and put equal volumes of water on one scale, something else, whatever you like, on the other scale. If the water is heavier, it will support the object that is lighter than itself. And if the lighter it is, the more it will stand out above the water. But if the weights of the water and the other thing you're weighting it against are equal, it will neither go to the bottom nor stand out. It will be level with the water and it will float, but almost submerged and not protruding at any point. So here we have both a recipe and a recording of something looking very much like an experimental procedure. You can imagine doing it, you can even do it. It's a reiterative procedure that leads to a better understanding of the fact that light bodies will float. But there is a second step of the exercise, which is imagine what happens in the equilibrium. What if the body is equal in weight with water? Well, Seneca tells you what happens, and it gives you a very interesting detail on how floating occurs. So you can say that the second step of the exercise is giving you a better understanding of what floating means. Floating can happen in many ways on the outer surface of the water, at the level of the water, inside of the water. Unsurprisingly, another exercise comes, which is about floating objects. And here Seneca tells us the story of the floating island that he has seen once, which had trees on it and so on. And this story, which is, that's what natural history is about, it's about stories, is supplemented with an imaginative exercise, which is that if you ever see a floating island, that will have very light rocks, very light and porous rocks. So mark that we have moved from an exercise in which physical enactment was perfectly possible, the balanced one, to one in which imagination and fictions play a key role. Look for floating islands and determine the density of the rocks there. It's somehow unlikely that we are going to do that. But what we can do is to do the exercise in our imagination, because we have learned how bodies float and what is a state of equilibrium. Where are all these exercises leading? Well, the end of book 3 ends on fanfare with the big flood. And I wanted to read this with you and show how fantastic it is, but You actually have the quote in my paper and you can read it for yourself. It's a phenomenal description of how water begins to pour and the level of water increases and the whole earth submerges. The earth is not merely damaged, but is submerged and the whole human race is destroyed. How? By successive catastrophic events. And then, of course, we ask, why are this happening? And Seneca says, well, remember the story of the equilibrium of the body? The body of the earth is like human body, and when the body becomes unhealthy, what happens is that a discrete unbalance between water and the rest of the elements in favor of water produces what we have already seen, submerging the dry land under the water. It's a bit more complex and much more interesting than that, but that's basically the idea. And what is interesting is that if you read the paragraph, you immediately relate to what Seneca is doing. We translate it automatically. You translate it automatically. He talks, for example, of the melting of the glaciers, and we know what that means. So we immediately relate to that. We translate it automatically into our frame of mind. And somehow, although so obscure and coming from such an obscure context, it's easier to relate to than Marcus Aurelius' exercises. Now, one lesson in reading in this manner, Seneca's imaginative exercises, is to draw meaningful parallels with other meditations on death. The flood is an enactment on a different scale and in a different language of these catacombs of death that are part of the natural law. It even ends in the same tonality as Marcus' exercise on death by picturing the serene state of the earth after the destruction and the law of eternal return. And you have a passage in my paper, which is fantastically beautiful and conveys the same feeling of serenity in front of the natural law. What this very similar structure shows, I think, is that Seneca really puts the tradition of spiritual exercises to work in a different enterprise, one that is teaching-oriented. He draws on what everyone knows being traditional meditations of death, enacts them and expects the reader to recognize the pattern and to be able to enact it further because he addresses readers familiar with the practice of meditation. In other words, he does what every talented teacher does. He begins from what is familiar to lead the reader into the unexplored realm of the secrets of nature. So in this paper, I try to put to work the principles of Hadot's formative exegetics. And I have kind of tried to show that if you introduce the concept of enactment, that is so dear to people like me working on history of science, then things are making sense somehow. And I don't pretend to have done much because the result that we have reached is perhaps a bit new, but also familiar. It is new because we might have forgotten to read texts as detectives, but it's familiar at the end of the day because we can relate to the practices recorded in imaginative exercises. I claimed at some point that we all do spiritual exercises. I would like to end by pointing a very specific area in which we do nothing by that, which is teaching. When teaching, we try to consciously change our students' perspective. We try to reposition them imaginatively, while also experiencing ourselves some of this imaginative repositioning. In any true situation of learning, something like a spiritual exercise, at least imaginative exercise, is lurking in the background, sometimes not fully spelled out. Good teaching is about seeing things from a different perspective. And perhaps it is also about reaching together the objective perspective of the view from above. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. And now the second speaker, Sorana Corneanu.
Thank you, Dan. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share, so I'm going to do that.
Okay.
can see it, can you? Good. Okay. So my topic is lived logic. This is largely based on previous work I've done on the question of the care of the soul in the early modern period. So this is systematizing a bit some of that material, but also it comes from a more recent interest in the shapes of logic in the early modern period. So this is where I come from with this talk. Let me just get to it. I'll begin with a quote from Hadot. In order to clarify first what he means by exercises, philosophy as practice, and then propose that we investigate what is meant by logic as practice. So this is the quotation. In order better to understand in what way ancient philosophy could be a way of life, it is perhaps necessary to have recourse to the distinction proposed by the Stoics, with the reference in Hadot is to Diogenes Laertius' lives, between, on the one hand, discourse about philosophy, the theory of philosophy, and philosophy itself. As far as philosophical discourse is concerned, we get these famous three parts of theoretical philosophy: physics, ethics, and logic. This is the Stoic tripartition. It has a long history after them. But Hadot continues, philosophy itself, that is the philosophical way of life, is no longer a theory divided into parts, but a unitary act which consists in living logic, physics, and ethics. In this case, we no longer study logical theory, that is the theory of speaking and thinking well. We simply think and speak well, and the same with the others. Now, the place in Diogenes Laertius that Hadot is quoting does not actually talk about living all these things or about philosophy as practice or as a way of life, but rather talks about the unitary body of philosophy that is only artificially divided into the three parts, and famously compares tells us about the Stoic comparison between philosophy itself with several things, among which an animal whose bones are logic, the flesh is ethics, and ethics and physics is the soul, right? But this is the general understanding that philosophy itself, in Hadot, philosophy itself is a practice. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to live philosophy for Hadot? Well, at the core of the notion of lived philosophy is, of course, the idea of exercise, forms of exercise or practice or work, which mean a mental training that turns theoretical doctrine, argument, logos into practical abilities of the soul, the psyche, the purpose of which is to achieve wisdom and happiness. And here I'd like to quote John Sellers's explanation of this in The Art of Living, where the big point is that we need to understand that for the Stoics, philosophy means both theory and practice, and they both need to accompany the training of the philosopher. So Sellers explains that askesis in this vocabulary translates the logoi of theoretical discourse into erga, works, activities, things that are done, practiced. So it means incorporating philosophical doctrines into one's everyday habits, and I want to emphasize habits here, and thus transforming character. This doesn't mean that ethics is the practical part and logic and physics the theoretical parts, by no means, but rather that each of these parts of philosophy include a theoretical and a practical part, and that the practice is meant to transform the soul, the capacities of the soul, in stable habits or stable dispositions of the soul. And this acquiring is done through training. So let me propose this definition. The exercises that are at the core of the idea of philosophy's practice are forms of philosophical work meant to grow philosophical habits in the soul and thus transform character in a philosophical way. Now, what does it mean to live logic in this picture? So how are we to understand the idea that the stuff of logic, the way we think, the judge, reason, can be taken up as transforming practices, since these are, after all, the substance of arguments and doctrines, the logoi. So in order to see the practical counterpart to this, I think we need to understand the types of philosophical work that can form logical habits. The other question I want to ask is whether this is a purely intellectual practice, or are there crossovers with the other quarters of the mind, the passions and the imagination? Dana has already opened up this vista for us. There's a lot of passions and imagination involved in these exercises. So my sources for this talk are, on the one hand, Epictetus in the Discourses, where he talks about the discipline of assent as the key practical component of logic. A text that is, of course, key for Hadot himself. And then I'd like to talk briefly about another text that Hadot does not talk about, but which I think is really interesting, quite fascinating. In fact, Galen's Passions and Errors of the Soul, where he too takes up the discipline of assent, but has some new things to say compared to Epictetus. And all of this in order to draw at the end some conclusions about the conceptual and historiographic gains that we might have if we study these sources and we understand the idea of logic as a practice. So first, Epictetus. Right, so Hadot tells us how Epictetus talks about 3 types of training in 3 areas. He calls it the 3 disciplines. These are the discipline of desire, the discipline of inclinations to action, and the discipline of avoidance of error and hasty judgment. And these are in turn what he calls practical physics, practical ethics, and logic. Now, okay, so logic would be the practice of avoiding error and hasty judgment. In Epictetus, in the Discourses, we get several places where it talks about logic, and it appears that there's an interesting interrelationship between the theoretical study of logic and the practice, the logical practice. On the one hand, the theoretical study of arguments. The structure of logic would be one that remained stable through centuries. Logic studies terms, propositions, and arguments, obviously, including syllogisms. The part on terms also includes their theory about how a judgment is formed, which is assent given to an impression. Right? So this would be what we would call the psychology of cognition. It also includes what we would call the epistemological part of the discussion, which is stuff on the criterion of judgment. So this is the study of logic. To study the theoretical study of arguments, the higher part, should come only after training and progress in the other 2 areas have been achieved. However, the study of terms and of the standard of judgment is useful early on. So the Stoic student would go to schools, as it were, and learn the theory. But then the practical discipline of assent, which is the training in how to give assent. You have the theory, how is judgment formed? There is an impression, and the mind reacts to that impression with this assent. Okay, there's the theory, but then you practice giving assent to impression, which for Epictetus is foundational for the other 2 disciplines too, of desire and intentions. And we heard an example in Dana's talk about how Marcus Aurelius thought that giving of assent is important in forming judgments of the external world, whether for ethical or natural philosophical purposes. The role of the discipline of assent is foundational for Epictetus. He calls it the first philosophical task and the essence of the good, since it is devoted to keeping our ruling center, the hegemonicon, the mind, the core mind, in accord with nature, the great Stoic rule of life. Right. This is theory. Once again, there are wrong ways of giving assent. That the Stoic theory will tell us how assent is wrongly given. Epictetus identifies these two important ways of giving assent in the wrong way: precipitate assent, given to an unclear impression, or deceived assent or false assent to a false impression. The problem is that wrong assent giving is the ground of both false opinions and wrong emotions and actions. So it is foundational for the whole philosophical project. And the key to the whole idea of practice in logic as in the others is, in fact, that training takes time, as well as moral and emotional involvement, courage, perseverance, and ideally issues in habits of correct assent giving, which in turn help with the other two disciplines. So let's look at some examples. Epictetus talks mainly about what we might call the sensory impressions and propositions. And I'd like to start presenting these examples with this quote, which I think is nice, when he says, as we train ourselves to deal with sophistical questioning, learn about the minutiae of arguments, so we should train ourselves each day to deal with impressions, because they too, impressions, put questions to us. And now, starting from this idea that impressions, presentations, the first way in which the mind encounters the world, puts questions to us, Epictetus is to develop what we might call dramatic scenarios in which the mind becomes an actor and is shown to enter a dialogue with the impressions. An example in the same place is, here's a thought, here is something that happens. The son of so-and-so has died. In principle, this immediately produces grief. Right? The reply of the mind that is learning how to give assent in the right way is that the death lies outside the sphere of choice, so it is nothing bad. Now, what this has in the background is obviously the Stoic theory of what is bad, of value, what is bad, what is good, and what is indifferent. But here, what is going on is, with the theory at the back of your mind, you are engaging in an active dialogue with what is happening around you. And you do this repeatedly, and you do this every day. The other example is quite similar, but this time it's no longer about evaluating an event, as in the case of the dead son, but rather the scenario is that of a dramatic struggle, power confrontation with impressions that in principle or usually create powerful corporeal, primarily powerful corporeal feelings, passions, like lust, for example. The famous example of Socrates and Alcibiades in Plato's Symposium is adduced, and Epictetus tells us how you need to fortify yourself when met with the pleasurable impression of a desirable young man or woman. and he presents the whole thing as a story of how the impression exerts enormous power, violent power on your mind, and you need to talk to the impression. Don't allow yourself to be dazed by the rapidity of the impact, but say, wait a while for me, my impression. Let me see what you are and what your impression of. Let me test you. And this is how he continues. The true athlete is formed. The true athlete is not the one in the arena, but the one who trains himself to confront the impressions. Both examples are continued by a text that says, and this is how habits, good habits of assent giving are formed. All right. It's taking too long. So Galen now, the rapprochement between Galen and Epictetus has reason. Galen was the personal physician to Marcus Aurelius, who himself followed Epictetus in much of what he thought and wrote, so far as Stoic philosophy is concerned. So let me go a bit more quickly through this. In this text, the affections and errors of the soul, Galen talks about first the affections and then the errors. He writes like a Stoic, quite recognizably. And when he gets to the errors, to the part on errors, he goes through pretty much the same kind of valuation of assent and assent giving as Epictetus. Say maladies of assent, he adds weak assent. This is to give assent in the wrong way is wrong in a supreme way, because it makes you unable to deal with questions about good and evil, which constitute the ultimate inquiry of anyone's life. The questions about the goal of life are really the most important questions that you can pursue. And if you're not armed with the right kinds of habits of giving assent to, this time, judgments and arguments in the right way, you're lost. You will not just get things wrong, but you will live an unhappy life. What I'd like to note about this is, one, that Galen tells us that wrong assent giving comes from self-regard, boastfulness, false pretense of wisdom. So it involves, as a basic disposition, passions and moral inclinations of the wrong side, way, of the wrong form, and it flows from what he calls the same desire for more. The Greek has pleonexia, which is really the Stoic notion of insatiability, which is contrasted with self-sufficiency. Okay, so this is where wrong assent giving comes from. Who does it? Well, everyone, but also, and this is new compared to Epictetus, all the schools of philosophy. All the philosophers are bad at this. They don't know how to judge theories and arguments in the right way. All of them, Platonists, Epicurean, Stoics, Peripatetics, academics or sceptics, but above all, the cynics. Doesn't like them. Why? Because they're more interested in sectarian disputes and the winning over of addicts. So they cultivate dogmatism and credulity. So it's quite strong evaluation, and sounds very much like kind of discourse going on in the early modern period. Okay. The training of assent, again, like Epictetus, you cultivate assent, and through this you cultivate the soul, the rational faculty, and this is the path to happiness. It takes patience and time, and you should begin early on. If you continue in the habit of wrong assent, for more than 3 or 4 years, you're lost. That's an induration of the soul happens, and that's incurable. Who is capable of of good habits of sense giving? The practitioners of the logical arts, he calls them. And who are they? In a fantastic list that includes what later on will be called the liberal arts: mathematicians, statisticians, geometers, astronomers, architects, lawyers, orators, grammarians, and musicians. All of these are to be contrasted with philosophers or fraudulent philosophers. Now, the other interesting thing about this text is that it gives us, in the manner of a procedure of what to do, the following list of points. So first of all, you need to understand whether questions which are not evident, like questions about good and bad, admit of proof by argument, and what it means is logical proof or demonstration. And then what you do is make inquiry into this method. So the inquiry into the method, which for him, as you can see here, the method he recommends is that of the geometrical method of analysis and synthesis. And he gives some examples of how this is applied to matters, as he says, where the solution is evident from the observed facts, or like geometrical problems, dividing a line into a prescribed number of parts. He also gives the example of constructing a sundial or a water clock. Okay, so you need to understand the method, to not just to understand the method. He says this is not something to be done in a casual manner, but over a long period of time. In association with experts. And who are the experts in this vocabulary? Those who have mastered themselves and who are on the right kind of path to truth. Okay, you've done this, you've trained yourself, go on. That's the third step. Just go on, continue to subject yourself to training for a considerable additional period. Okay. So this is the recommendation. All right, I'll just go to the conclusions and try to summarize the main points of what I've presented. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that this reconstruction of Stoic thought allows us to approach thinking as an activity, as work. Which I think is a gain. What does this mean? It means that you can look at the motions and habits of the mind as the counterpart of the logical operations. And if you do that, there is a historiographic gain. For example, you understand better the shapes of early modern logic and method when they are presented as arts for perfecting the mind. That's one. The second is, this is a great way of integrating the domains of knowledge and mind. As I explained, you take the parts of philosophy as instances of a unifying philosophical practice. And you take intellect, passions, imagination, and moral dispositions as instances of a unified mental practice. And things start to look a little bit differently. If, for example, you get the early modern context from this practice-centered approach, you start seeing cross-references between logic, criticism of the faculties of the soul, practical divinity, and natural philosophy that start making sense. Finally, looking back to Galen's identification of the bad philosophers versus the good logicians, this is a good way to look at philosophy from the perspective of the identity of the philosopher and his or her community, since this allows us to look at polemical uses of the good practice of thinking. From this perspective, competing communities can be identified, and this has fed the early modern persona, approaches to natural philosophy from the perspective of the persona of the philosopher. Thank you. This was my presentation. Stop sharing.
Thank you very, very much, Sarana. And the third speaker will be Paul Lodge.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm going to share something as well. And yeah, I'll start the show. So this is going to be a slightly different kind of thing, a bit more, not as serious, a bit more entertainment rather than the kind of scholarship we've already seen from my predecessors. I want to talk about philosophy as a way of life in a more kind of generic sense. So I'm going to have three parts to my presentation. I'm going to talk about the ubiquity of POWL. Then I want to look at a particular approach to thinking about what philosophy as a way of life might be, which is in the work of, it should be Caleb Coho and Stephen Grimm. And then I want to say a few things about or reflect on what they've said and just open up space really rather than reach any clear conclusions. So the ubiquity of philosophy as a way of life. So at least within some circles, I think philosophy as a way of life is everywhere. It emerges, as I say, as the title of an essay by Pierre Hadot, who you've heard mention, if you've not heard of him before, many times already. And that essay was part of a book which was partly translated into English with that essay as the title of the book, even though the French didn't originally have that in 1995. So that's when Hadot really stepped into the English-speaking world. And then other people started to, if not exactly use that expression, certainly write things which are very similar in focus. And indeed, John Cooper's book in 2012 introduces its topic by explicitly drawing some contrasts with the ways in which John is working and Hadot is working. And that was published in 2012, but he'd been working on that for a while. And there are a couple of lecture series, John Locke lectures, the Tanner lectures, which were basically that book on its way to being produced. And then in 2013, we got this Festschrift essentially for Hadot with lots of articles, lots of interesting articles about various aspects of philosophy as a way of life. And then John Sellers, who's already been mentioned, published various things, and I just noting here, 2017, there's an article which explicitly mentions philosophy as a way of life in the title, though lots of his other work makes reference to Hadot in the context primarily of his study of Stoicism. In 2020, we get a whole journal of meta-philosophy, which is dedicated to philosophy as a way of life. I'm guilty of being in there and contributing to the ubiquity, as I tried to say something about whether you could think of Leibniz as offering philosophy as his philosophy as a way of life. And now there's going to be a whole series. Brill are going to solicit studies, edited volumes, whatever, that are somehow connected with this philosophy as a way of life notion. And it goes on. So there's a Mellon philosophy project at Notre Dame, some of you may know about. And this is about sort of applying the idea of philosophy as a way of life within the teaching part of the academy. So Megan Sullivan is the PI on this project, and they have a Facebook page, they've got a YouTube channel. That thing in the bottom right-hand corner is the video, which kind of introduces the project. And one of the ideas, at least, is that they want to get people to do kind of introductions to philosophy within the university, which involve presenting kind of philosophical ways of life, as Hadot would have called them, like Epicureanism or Stoicism. And actually, one of the things people have been talking about a lot tonight already is the notion of a spiritual exercise. And the idea is that instead of just studying the Epicurean, as a kind of object of study, you're supposed to live as an Epicurean for a week or two and try and play out what it would be to inhabit that way of life. So that's an interesting kind of project. And then outside of the academy, and I think Ryan is here actually, we have this, the Daily Stoic, which is shows this kind of appetite for something which is not explicitly connected, with Hadot, but is it involves trying to get people to have the equipment that they might need in order to live Stoicism as a way of life in some sense. And you can see from some of the advertisement that, you know, loads of people are interested in this. And you can get various things, like you can get kind of daily emails to help you practice this way of life, and you can buy things like the Memento Mori medallion there, which that's just the back side of it. The flip side has a skull on it, and that will help you, if you keep it in your pocket, it will help you kind of reflect on the need to keep doing your exercises. So it's sort of everywhere, and one could think about philosophy as a way of life in lots of different ways. One of the things, as I said, that I tried to do was think about whether, you know, what could we think about somebody like Leibniz? Hadot suggests very few modern philosophers, and certainly contemporary philosophers, are thinking of philosophy as a way of life. And so I explored a little bit what scope there is for thinking of Leibniz in that way, and perhaps more than I'd expected in some ways. But today I want to do something different, which is, as I said, to look at Caleb Coho and Stephen Grimm attempt to modernize, in a way, Hadot. I mean, maybe that's not quite fair, but to say in their own terms what they think is constitutive of philosophy as a way of life. It's actually quite hard to distill that out of Hadot. I mean, he doesn't really set it out very neatly and very clearly. And it turns out that what they say is not quite the same as him anyway. So today I just thought I'll focus on them. So here they are. So there's Caleb Coho and Stephen Grimm. They are actually both advisors or advisory board members for the Notre Dame project that Megan Sullivan is doing. And they've got 2 papers that they published in within the last year. One in that meta philosophy volume that I mentioned, and there's another one in the European Journal of Philosophy. What it takes to live philosophically, or how to progress in the art of living, is the first. What is philosophy as a way of life? Why philosophy as a way of life is the second. I'm going to focus on the first of those, though the bits that I'm going to take out of it, I think, are almost identical in the second one. And of course, I'm whizzing through, so I hope I'm being suitably charitable. But yeah, it's a sketch that I'm going to give. So in this paper, which I'll abbreviate WTLP, C and G, I'll keep with my abbreviations just so that the slides don't get crazy. They highlight I'm going to highlight 3 key components that they want to draw attention to. So they tried to say something about what it is to live a way of life. And then they talk about the difference between complete achievement and moderate conceptions of living a philosophical way of life. And then they give us 3 conditions, which I think they're necessary conditions. I'm not sure whether they're supposed to be necessary and sufficient. And they are conditions on living a philosophical way of life. So what is it to live a way of life? So one of the things they want to get clear about at the beginning is that we should distinguish between just kind of finding ourselves in a situation where a way of life is being lived out. So they don't have an expression for that. I talk about being inducted into a way of life and then living it, where the latter, they say, is a kind of an achievement. I mean, I think that the idea is that if we think most naturally, I guess we could think of being born into a certain religious tradition. That doesn't straightforwardly make you an adherent of that tradition. And typically, actually, traditions often have kind of rites of passage at the point where one might think that children are in a position to affirm and kind of commit to living in that way. So you've got confirmation, which I went through being brought up as a Catholic, and obviously we've got bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in the Jewish tradition, and other rites of passage in other cultures as well. So that seems an interesting and useful distinction to draw. And they talk about being, growing up in America is not sufficient for living the American way of life. And I say it requires, they may not say that. I mean, I guess, obviously, you don't have to start out being living in America and growing up there. As I say, I don't want to pin that on them. That may just me being a bit sloppy. But you have to come to live in that context, let's say. And then it requires positively aiming at living in accordance with the norms that govern the American way of life. Whether one does that or not, what counts as doing that, of course, in this particular context is particularly hard to decide and particularly contentious. The second point they meant to make is they want to distinguish between complete achievement and moderate conceptions of living, in this case, a philosophical way of life, but I guess it would apply to other ways of life as well. And what are they trying to get at there? Well, they want to distinguish between people who are complete exponents. According to this view, they say a philosophical way of life is a supreme achievement available only to the great and the wise. And they suggest that we might think that someone like Nietzsche or Foucault advertises philosophy as that kind of thing, that you can only be a philosopher if you're one of the great and the wise. And they say, you know, obviously it naturally is associated with the figure of the sage in ancient philosophy. And going back to John Cooper's book, Pursuits of Wisdom, they suggest that this is, Cooper primarily has this in mind, which they think is a problem, because they want to contrast it with moderate conceptions, and they're worried about a kind of elitism. And they also just want to draw attention to the fact that you have to start somewhere, and that doesn't mean you're not already living the kind of life that you're living, whether it be philosophical or whatever. And that this notion of being committed to progress is enough to be living a certain kind of life, the life of a musician. There's little Mozart. We assume even Mozart, as they say, missed a few beats at that point. So, you know, it didn't mean that he wasn't already living the musical life. I don't think, when his dad was dragging him around Europe. So they want to distinguish progressors as well as sages. Right, so there's a couple of things in the background. And then they give us three conditions. And they do only give us three conditions. They're elaborated to some extent, and those are conditions on living a philosophical way of life. Whether they're necessary and sufficient, I'm not entirely sure, but I think they are supposed to be necessary. So what's the first one? We're told that practitioners of a philosophical way of life are committed to, the one is mine, the square brackets are mine, truth claim making, and value prescribing worldview. So there are three components there. Here's a bit of text that gives us a little bit more of a handle into what they mean. So truth claim making, here's a gloss. Philosophical ways of life need to be making truth valuable claims. For example, it may be therapeutic for you to think your thoughts as putting positive energy out into the universe, but if someone presses you on what this means and you say it's merely a figure of speech, you're not seriously affirming it, so you're not making a truth claim. The third one, I'll go to the next. So the third one is there has to be a worldview. Philosophical way of life includes views about humanity and our place in the cosmos. It should not just make a few claims about a very limited sphere of life, hence the idea of a worldview. And then the second one is the value prescribing one. And they say that it's included to get at the idea that the worldview behind the way of life has to be action guiding and comprehensive. And there's a little bit more to that there, which I won't read given time. Condition 2, practitioners of a philosophical way of life have their practices and life structured by the worldview to which they're committed. So they say a person's life does not have to be perfectly ordered. That's the progressor. It doesn't have to be the sage. But direction and attitude of the person's life matters. Philosophical progressors must have made some advance in understanding and living out their school's thought before they can count as practicing it and hence living it. And the structure needs also to be relatively global and sustained. One thing that's interesting, again, referring back to Dana and Sarana, they never talk about spiritual exercises at all. There might be something implicit here about the need to do something to keep progressing, but they never explicitly point to the idea that spiritual exercises are a necessary condition. And that was a big part of Hadot's claim to fame, if you like. The third condition, the practices and life of practitioners of a philosophical way of life are constitutively, and again, there are two things, they're truth directed and they're responsive to reasons. What does truth directedness mean? They say, as we conceive it, it requires that the characteristic activities of your way of life be truth conducive, conditional on your worldview being right. So, you know, it has to be the case in some sense that you're aiming at the truth. You might not be getting at the truth because you might be completely way off base. And importantly, they want to say that allows that things other than kind of producing arguments still count as truth directed. So they say, for example, they've got other examples. They talk about Iris Murdoch saying paying attention to things that they don't use her kestrel example, but a famous kestrel example could be something that enabled you to gain truth. And they also say that if it's the case that Buddhism is true, then meditating with the rest of Buddhism in mind, such that you try to appreciate emptiness, would be truth directed. So it's got nothing to do with propositional attitudes or anything like that. But they do say that those living a philosophical way of life must be reasons responsive. Reason, though they don't say explicitly what they mean by that, has an important role to play in why they, the practitioner, hold the view they do. They're also sensitive to defeaters of their views. They do not merely hope the practices they're following turn out to be truth conducive. They're following them because they reasonably believe them and are open to being convinced otherwise. Okay, so those are the three conditions. And now I just want to, and they really are reflections that they're not kind of exhaustive. There's some of the things that have come to mind. And again, with limited time, I just thought I'd throw a few of them out here today. So I want to look at conditions 1 and 3. I think condition 2 seems okay. But some things in condition 1 and 3 struck me as perhaps having at least challenges which could be posed for them. So condition 1 says practitioners of a philosophical way of life are committed to truth claim making, values prescribing worldview. So can that accommodate skepticism? They do, Coho and Grimm do mention Pyrrhonian skeptics, but in what sense do Pyrrhonians have a worldview, given that we're told that this includes views about humanity and our place in the cosmos, not just make a few claims about a very limited sphere of life? So that I don't straightforwardly see how those two fit together. Maybe they can. Condition 2, question 2, can condition 1 accommodate what I want to call seekers? So it doesn't seem to me that they should be able to rule out people who are just seriously struggling to, what I'm saying here is kind of work out the meaning of life without having a much clearer conception of what they're doing than that. Why isn't that if you're really trying to do it really hard and you don't have all these external kind of access to all these ideas of the past, does that stop you from being a philosopher or living philosophically? And what about Novalis? Philosophy, according to Novalis, is really homesickness, an urge to be at home everywhere. So extrapolating from that, living philosophy as a way of life for Novalis and other romantics perhaps would be to kind of live out this urge. It wouldn't be to live and inhabit a worldview that was action guiding. In fact, you might think that for someone like Novalis, that would be a kind of post-philosophical way of living. If you could get there, you might end up lacking homesickness because you'd found that kind of home. And I think it's important just to pause at this point and remember that this notion of a worldview is not one that Hadot himself was thinking of or the importance of it was for Hadot was not quite the same as it seems to be for Coho and Grimm, because it's true that Hadot did focus and talk about the worldviews that various philosophical schools presented their proponents with, and talked about how to kind of internalize them and the way that spiritual exercises might do that. But one of the really important things he was trying to do was to remind us that this was different from the way that his contemporaries, or many of his contemporaries, were thinking about philosophy. He wanted to get across the idea, in part, as well as being a serious scholar of ancient philosophy, that it wasn't just a theoretical pursuit. It wasn't just trying to you couldn't step back and just learn some stuff about philosophy. That wasn't the point. So I think, there's something about the way in which to draw on this kind of living out philosophy idea for Hadot was making a different kind of point from the one that they're trying to make. Condition 3, I said I'm going to leave condition 2 out. Condition 3 says the practices and life of practitioners of a philosophical way of life are constitutively truth-directed and responsive to reasons. So let me go for the reasons responsive element first. Again, I don't know. I mean, skepticism is very hard to pin down as a position, but certainly you might wonder whether all ways of being a skeptic leave you reasons responsive. And then what about a Cartesian? Somebody who's really taken Descartes seriously. At least some of what's constitutive of the world view, if one is living it out, is supposed to be indubitable. And so they had told us that reasons responsiveness, as they understood it, meant that you were open to being convinced otherwise. That seems like an odd constraint to put on living out a philosophical way of life in the way they seem to understand it. And focusing on the constitutively truth-directed element, one maybe is a bit facile, but I thought I'd throw it in there. What about deflationists? There's Paul Horwich looking like he's living a very happy deflationist way of life. If truth is just a predicate which exists for the sake of convenience, then what would it be to be directed to the truth at all? Would that stop you being a philosopher if you're a deflationist? And then, of course, what about Derrida? And not just Derrida, but what about kind of, I'm labeling them post-structuralists, but what about people whose way of thinking, which it's hard, I wouldn't want to say isn't philosophy, has an uncertain relationship to there being subjects which are agents. It's hard to know how one could live that kind of life in a truth-directed way in anything like the way that Coho and Grimm want us to think of it. The more general point here from all of this, of course, is that conditions 1 and 3 seem to take for granted that engaging in philosophy involves satisfying conditions that take a contestable stance on the nature of philosophy itself. And there is this kind of this massive potential other voices that, you know, too many to identify in that photo. And we don't know how that might change how we might think about the possibilities of living philosophically. We're in an interesting time where we're being forced to think about that again. A final point, I think it's my last point. There's something about philosophy as a way of life and living a religious life, which strikes me as kind of important to reflect on. It was something that Hadot certainly reflected on. I mean, and I'm not sure what to think about the relationship between the two, but one might think that they're different ways of life, that to live a philosophical life and to live a religious life are two different things. One might not, but one might. It certainly looks like conditions 1 to 3 could be satisfied by someone who's living a religious life. And really the issue is that they just don't say enough about this as far as I'm concerned. You know, you might think you could distinguish them because a religious life wouldn't be reasons responsive. They don't say that. One might want to think that. Or, as I said, they might think that there's no tension whatsoever. Hadot did, focusing on Christianity. He thought the religious life was unlike philosophical life. Why? Because it always presupposed the help and grace of God, as well as the fundamental disposition of humility. So to be religious on this view is to structure one's life around the hope of divine intervention. And as I say, it's not that Coho and Grimm are kind of going in a way that's obviously problematic. They're just not really saying enough, I think, is the issue. It seems like there's a question here. So I just want to stop now with one final remark. I mean, I think one of the things one might take home as a lesson is that maybe the whole project of trying to say in the way that they're doing what philosophy as a way of life is the problem. Maybe that's not the right way to go about doing it. I mean, Hadot was really trying to get us to see what it was to live as an Epicurean, what it was to live as a Stoic, where the assumption was they're obviously philosophical ways of life with no, he says some other things which are more generic, but yeah, I mean, one of the lessons might be that. But I think what you can see in Coho and Grimm is an inclination that I have some sympathy with, namely trying to find something that would gather together those people under an umbrella who take themselves to want to live philosophically, something to bind the philosophers together as a community. And maybe there's some hope for just going with what Cooper says, namely that philosophy is just the pursuit of wisdom, and leaving that very, very open-ended. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I'm not sure how to get rid of this. There we go. Thanks, Dan.
The floor is open for questions, discussions, comments. Would anybody like to begin? Well, I'll venture a question. To Donna, specifically about an intersection between her interests in Hadot and philosophy as a way of life and Bacon. I'm wondering if you could read, for example, Bacon's Silva Silvarum as an as a kind of map for, or perhaps alternatively, the New Atlantis as maps for living an experimental philosophical way of life.
Well, yeah, that's precisely the point. I kind of started more than 10 years ago to look for how Bacon worked with his Seneca. And I abandoned that project because I didn't know how to read Seneca's Naturales Questiones. So what I shared with you tonight is my thrill that I finally understand that if you approach from this perspective of thinking of practices that is so dear to historians of science, it suddenly makes sense. Well, it's not the whole story. There are a bit more others there. There are other things there. There is, for example, a couple of very interesting recent articles that are talking about Seneca's judicial modes of argumentation and the way in which the Naturales Questiones looks like an inquisitio at the bar. And if you take that, then you get to Bacon. And of course, I put there the example of waiting water for those of you who might remember their Bacon, to show that you have some direct influences as well. Now, whether Bacon wants to live a philosophical way of life, I don't know, because what I was trying to look here was that at something different, namely that regardless of the general purpose of being, Seneca is not, after reading Seneca for a long time, I got into that camp which claims that Seneca is basically a heretic. He's taking these very nice Stoic exercises to do something different with them. And he's very liberal in the way he applies them. And I try to show you here such an example of how he plays with meditations on death to do something which in the end is different. And the only common point between the two is his interest in teaching. And I think that that's where the next step is. So that's what, I mean, people love the Naturales Questiones. I didn't go to get through the flood and things like this. And this is a very interesting example of a book that everyone read, although they didn't know how to read it. So they just read these parts, these bits and pieces, these imaginative exercises. Now, whether the experimental way of life, that's complicated, yes, in a way. So again, what we see in Seneca is that he is using the tradition of meditations to go into the direction of something which is more like a philosophical theater. And that he does that both in the epistles, and he does that in the Naturales Questiones, and in the natural questions you also have elements of physics and contemplating the universe and so on. So in a way it is a lived physics. And you can very easily add to this, actually doing these exercises. Again, there are all sorts of missing bits and pieces here, such as the fact that some people read parts of bits and pieces of what I explained today and took them in the direction of natural history, for example. And why not? Some took it in the direction of a more experimental philosophy. So yes, I think there is a lot to be done here in how Seneca did his bricolage, starting from. So if the main lesson of Hadot is in a way that we are made of very few sources, and if we know how to read, then sources are more easily recognizable. So the problem of recognizing the bricolage is not that sources are too diverse. It's that they are not that diverse. It's just that they are used in different ways. And they are not always quoted in the same way in which people are, taking it from. I think we just need to do this exercise. We still need to do this exercise for Bacon and for other early modern philosophers. To find sources, to find how they play with sources, to find how the bricolage was assembled. And then perhaps we can start thinking of, what are they saying here really?
Okay, thank you. There's a question on the chat from Alberto Luis Lopez for Sorana.
Hi, thank you, Sorana. I was wondering, because in your abstract, you have two questions. We say that, what does it mean for logic to believe? Or in other words, how are we to understand the idea that the stuff of logic, thinking, judging, reasoning, and so on, can be taken off as a transforming practice? And I don't know if you have something to say. I was thinking that, both questions are framed in the idea of the idea of philosophy as a way of life. So my question is, I don't know if emotions or intuitions, both you can consider or take into account emotions and intuitions as useful for logic, and if so, in what sense could be useful for logic, but understanding this and logic in this broad frame of philosophy as a way of life. So this is my question. I don't know if it was clear.
Yes, thank you, Alberto. When framing the initial question like that, what I had in mind specifically was the shape of the examples of exercises that I gave, especially the one in Epictetus, that dramatic scenario of engaging in passionate dialogue with the impression. It seemed to me that at this level of the practical exercise, the activity of forming judgments does involve the whole psyche, as Hadot would put it. So not just some kind of pure mind, pure intelligence, but the whole person, including this passionate element. That is to say, if you picture this encounter with the impressions as a struggle, as a conflict that you need to overcome, then you do, it does sound like partly an imaginative exercise of the kind Dana is describing. You picture yourself in this situation, you reenact sort of that scenario in your mind, but also you engage your passionate person as well, because the fight is of the person, I suspect. I wonder, though, I tried to figure out while thinking of this, whether this is not me with my 21st century mind understanding what Epictetus was doing there, and whether this scenario might have been understood by him as one of carried out by a dispassionate mind. I don't know. But these examples of what I would call passionate dialogue, passionate exchange, these examples are numerous in Epictetus, the dialogue. And it's not the Socratic dialogue that is going on there. It's a sort of inner dialogue. So I thought at this level of forming the good habits in the mind, it does look like the imaginations and the passions are involved. But again, I'm wondering whether this is a question of perspective or not, of historical perspective. And then with the reference to Galen, it struck me that what he says about the source of wrong assent giving as being insatiability, so a sort of moral, basic moral dysfunction, if you like, that is for Galen, as for Stoics, behind both passions and errors. So it's not, error is not a matter of formal breaches, right? Breaches of formal rules, but something going wrong at the level of, again, the whole psyche, functioning of the whole psyche that involves passions, judgments, and moral dispositions. And that's why I thought at the level of practice, that metaphor of the body of philosophy with all the parts, intermingling with each other, does make sense not only at an epistemological level, where you can see how these disciplines mingle or overlap, but actually makes much more sense at the level of the activities of the mind goes through in this process of practicing philosophy. Yeah, I think that's what I had in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question from Ville Paukonen.
Yeah, thanks for all of you. I have a comment for Paul and a related question for Sorana. And the comment is that it seems, thank you very much for the talk. I did not know about this contemporary stuff about philosophy as a way of life, but it seems that one difference that seems like a major difference to what Hadot thinks is going on within ancient philosophy is that within ancient philosophy, according to Hadot, and maybe that's his Neoplatonic prejudice, which might not apply as widely as he thought, there's something like finding your true self. He speaks about dividing the self and getting rid of the unessentials of the self and becoming the true you. And that's a way of talk that's very foreign from contemporary point of view. So we sort of rather talk about finding meaning in life and so forth. So maybe that's one potential difference between the sort of the original Hadot kind of project of philosophy as a way of life and the contemporary one. I wonder what you think. And a question to Sorana, which is kind of related, is it's really a clarificatory question. What is it really to live logic, to live a philosophical life of logic? I'm not sure if I quite understand it. And I think Hadot isn't that clear either. His example are the Stoics, and he says that in Stoics' case, the ethics and the physics and the logic, they appear together. They're always, it doesn't seem to be, there are not really pure cases. When you live philosophical physics, you somehow mirror the universe within you, or as in Plato's Timaeus, it is reaching what is important in life in understanding how the universe works, and it has ethical relevance. And I guess a similar story is told for ethics, but logic, somehow it's hard to grasp. How could it be something substantial like that? It seems that life of logic really is something like using the organon, correcting your mistakes and so on. But is there more of a substantial story of what is a philosophical life of logic, as there is philosophical life of physics and of ethics?
Donna? I'm sorry, Sarana? You're not on.
Am I now? Yeah.
Yes.
Phil, I think the question is not well put, because I don't think according to this view, you can talk about separately about the philosophical life of logic, a philosophical life of physics, philosophical life of ethics. Hadot's point, which I think is quite right, at least with regard to the Stoics, is that the way of life is one, and it integrates. It'd be nice if I could see your face while I'm talking to you. There you are. So the philosophical way of life, the philosophical practice, is one, and it integrates element of practice from all these three divisions of philosophy. For example, in the example that I gave from Epictetus, that kind of exercise does have, or could be seen as part of the of lived ethics, or of an ethical can be seen as having an ethical outcome. You learn how to master your passions. You learn how to govern your grief and your lust, right? So it's not per se a logical exercise with a logical outcome, but it is an exercise that involves the discipline of judgment. And from Epictetus' perspective, this is logical practice. Okay, so this is responding to an impression, the impression of the beautiful boy, or responding to an evaluation of how things are from an ethical, from a moral point of view, good or bad, as in the example of the dead son. So that's responding to a proposition about something that is good or bad, right? As I said, formation of assent, you might think is not really logical matter, but it was for the Stoics. It became such for the moderns too in the 17th century. It was not for Aristotle, but it was again for the Stoics. For them, it was part of what logic was. If you thought of logic as beginning not simply with terms, but through how notions are formed, right? Very early modern stuff, actually. So that the first thing, there's no separate logical life. Second thing, this is a practice that enacts a bit of the logical theory, has to do with formation of judgment and with assent to propositions. The example from Galen, I thought, was particularly interesting because it did bring in more, substantial, as you're saying, logical stuff, as that method he invokes, the geometrical method of analysis and synthesis. You might think this is not logic. Well, not originally, but it is the case that logical theory in the antiquity, as far as I understand, I'm not a master of this topic, does model itself in many ways on geometrical reasoning with specific reference to the Pierre of analysis and synthesis. Analysis as the procedure that starts from a posited unknown and through following the concomitants and the correlations and the consequence arrives at a first principle or a proved theorem. That's the analysis, and then coming back from the first principle through the same concomitants, you get back to your unknown, which you then prove to be true or to exist. That's the the conception, I hope I got it right, of analysis and synthesis, which of course became one of the big themes in the early modern period as well. But the fact that Galen is saying not simply use the method or use the syllogism or use the organon, as you're saying, but train yourself in getting your mind composed in the right way, so you develop a habit of seeing things, judging things in this way. It does bring out a practical element, not simply applying a theory, but becoming modeled in your soul by this procedure, so that he can talk about these the method and the logical arts, as he calls them, talks about them as those that sharpen the soul, introduce good habits in the soul, etc., etc. I think it's a matter of how you look at these things, whether as a technical procedure or as one that can transform your mind. It's just that.
Thanks very much, Sorana. We have a number of questions, so maybe, and not that much time left. So perhaps we can try to shorten the questions and shorten the answers a little bit. Next is Richard Stryer.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed these presentations very much. I have just a note of gratitude to Daniela and an observation for Paul, and then an actual question for Sorana. For Daniela, I will forever be grateful for the ripe olive. What a fabulous image and a wonderful thing to carry around with you. And it seems like there's a real ideal there, what it would mean to die like a ripe olive. Magnificent, just a magnificent image. And thank you for that. And it helps, I think, philosophically. And for Paul, I had the thought that I thought it was very interesting, the last point about Descartes and what it would mean to sort of take seriously, are there things that should be indubitable? And it strikes me that the philosopher, that the contemporary, the modern philosopher, who takes that seriously and both thinks that something close to indubitability is true and that everything should be responsive to reason, is Quine, who thinks that ultimately even the truths of mathematics should in some sense or other be dubitable, although he never sort of explains how. But I think he's a philosopher who tries to sort of accommodate both the sense that there are things that are close to indubitable and that everything has to be dubitable. So Quine came to mind there. But for Sorana, my question is, I understand perfectly the notion of not being hasty and how important that is in many, many realms, passion, belief, etc. But what I don't quite get is, how is all that supposed to be the same as living according to nature? Where does that formula come in relation to all this other stuff? Because it kind of dropped out of the conversation.
It did, yes, thank you. It is the big Stoic rule, isn't it? So to live according to nature, as far as I understand it, is to live according to the rationality of the whole of the cosmos, right? The cosmos is an expression of rationality, of divine rationality, even though that is a material divinity. So it is to be in accord with how things are, right? I suppose there are many ramifications to this, but at the level of what I've been describing, I think the key notion here is that of the catalytic impression, the true impression, the impression that is the kind of representation in the mind that is objective, we might say. It's a true representation of how things are. And from the point of view of the Stoics, how things are, for example, includes death of even your own son being just a natural occurrence in accordance with the laws of the universe. Nothing more than that. So it shouldn't create grief. Grief would be a false representation of how things are. Just to give a very brief example or explanation.
I thought the insatiability thing might help in the sense of if living according to nature, if nature is inherently sort of modest and fairly easily satisfied, then it would be insatiability would be deeply against that.
Or maybe insatiability is, with a different sort of vocabulary, an example of self-love, not in any Augustinian sense, but in a sense that is related. That is, your focus is on yourself rather than on the greater whole of nature.
Thank you very much, Sorana. And this is probably going to be the last question. Michael Nuffy.
Always difficult to ask the last question, and especially so thank you all very much, because this is was a quite fascinating session, and because I'm very interested in Hadot's insight, and particularly on formative exegetics, and that's where I come into this conversation, because I work on such questions as the reception of Greek philosophy in Arabic and Islamic philosophy, and so I struggle with the idea of how do we make sense of these sort of texts and what does it mean, this kind of reception. But of course, I struggle with the same problem here, which is what does it mean to what is philosophy as a way of life? And I just wanted to share, because I think this is kind of a thread in this conversation that we've been having. I just wanted to share this particular thing that caught my attention when I was reading Hadot, which is chapter 8 of what is ancient philosophy, because in that chapter he actually explains the emergence of groups of philosophers who insisted on philosophy as a way of life as a reaction to the constitution of the schools during the imperial period. And so I think from that we can sort of draw this idea that philosophy as a way of life, in the way Hadot is kind of is interested in kind of expounding upon, is opposed or has to be maintained at a distance from precisely those things that I heard during especially the last talk, which is internalizing a worldview, value prescribing, in other words, to be distanced from doctrine, the doctrinal contexts of philosophy. I think this is I think an important insight of Hadot. And my question, for example, for Daniela, because I was thinking of my question, thinking about this and listening to the answers that you were giving to the questions that were asked to you, Daniela. You said Seneca was interested in teaching, but the question is teaching what? And I can understand what Sorana is talking about. This teaching about discipline of assent is not doctrine. It's not about doctrine at all. It's about forming a particular self that will be able to do logic properly, or whatever you want to call it. And but so could you elaborate on this thing that he's interested in teaching? And so
it's very simple. Virtue. He believes that can be taught. Mm-hmm. But not in any doctrinary way. It can be taught through imaginative exercises, spiritual exercises, by going together on the road to virtue, which is, of course, the road to knowledge. And that's the only thing worth kind of doing. So to Dan's answer, Seneca actually says that that's the only life worth living. The rest are not actually lives. And he has this very interesting comparison, this very interesting kind of image of people who are not living a philosophical life. They are not living, they're always prepared to live tomorrow. So they are not living today. They are thinking that they will start living in the next moment, or in the next moment, or in 5 minutes from now. My life will start. And this is fake, of course, because the 5 minutes from now doesn't exist.
Well, maybe this is the moment to end. And we'll see if 5 minutes from now does exist. And we will all return maybe to our fake lives or to our philosophical lives. But thank you, Donna, Sorana, and Paul, for a wonderful session.
Yep.
This was great. Next week will be J. Brian Pitts and Andrew Chignell on Leibniz on laws and spiritual causation. And we hope to see many of you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Thank you.